On his 17th birthday, my grandson looked at me across the table and said the words that cut deeper than any blade I had ever known. "You're nothing but an old man who couldn't even fight." The room went quiet for a second, but not long enough for the shame to vanish. His friends laughed nervously, the family shifted in their seats, and then conversation carried on as if nothing had happened. But I heard nothing else that night. The sentence lingered in the air, heavier than smoke, curling around my chest, suffocating. I sat there with my hands folded, the veins standing out against skin that had grown thin and frail, hands that had once carried rifles, lifted comrades, dug trenches in frozen mud. He looked at those same hands and saw only bones, tremors, weakness. To him, I was no more than the rusting husk of a man, the echo of a life too distant to matter. And perhaps that was my fault. I had raised silence like a wall around my past. I had never told him the stories, never let him hear the nights of hunger, the footsteps on broken streets, the decisions that still replayed in my mind when the house was dark and everyone else was asleep. But his eyes accused me. Without speaking, he told me I was nothing to learn from. His look said I was finished, outdated, irrelevant. And what stung was not only the disrespect, but the ease with which he believed it. For him, strength was muscle, noise, the arrogance of someone who had not yet been broken. He thought my silence meant emptiness. He thought my refusal to boast was proof I had nothing to boast about. I felt the sting of disappointment. Not mine alone, but his. His disappointment in me. To be judged by your enemy is expected. To be overlooked by a stranger is survivable. But to be dismissed by your own blood? That wound is different. It festers. It turns every breath into a reminder that what you sacrificed, what you endured, what you bled for, might already be forgotten before you are even gone. I chewed, slowly, tasting nothing, hearing only the echo of his words, an old man who couldn't even fight. He thought weakness lived in the stoop of my shoulders, in the slowness of my steps, in the cracks of my voice. He had no idea that true weakness isn't measured in how heavy a stone you can lift or how loud your voice can rise. True weakness is abandoning others when they need you most. He hadn't learned that yet. So I said nothing. I let him laugh. I let the family carry on. I let the label of weakness settle on me like dust. Because silence has always been my armor, even when it cuts to wear it. But that night, I felt something stir. Not anger, not pride, but a question. How long could I stay silent before the truth demanded to be heard? Friends, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, we continue. The laughter at the table was easy, careless, the kind of laughter that slips out when people believe they are safe. My grandson made his joke at my expense, a comment about how I could barely lift a chair, how I must have always been too fragile for anything harder than reading a newspaper. The others chuckled, not because they wished to wound me, but because it was easier to laugh than to stop and notice the cruelty beneath the words. I sat there, my fork resting against the plate, my eyes lowered, letting the sound wash over me like a tide I had no strength to resist. It was not the first time I had heard laughter like this. Long ago, when the war was still young, I had heard men laugh in the barracks, laugh at fear, laugh at hunger, laugh at one another's trembling hands as we waited for orders that might end in death. That laughter had always carried an edge, the sharpness of denial, the desperate attempt to hide terror under a mask of humor. But the laughter at my table now was different. It had no fear beneath it, no desperation. It was careless, unthinking, born from the arrogance of comfort. They did not know what it meant to be stripped down to nothing but willpower, to keep standing when your body begged you to fall. Each chuckle stirred old shadows in me, memories I had long buried. The mocking tone of his voice twisted into echoes of men who had once doubted me, who had looked at my thin frame and thought I would not last a week. And yet, I had lasted. I had endured the mud, the fire, the long nights without food or sleep. I had walked back when others had been carried. I had survived, though survival was not always the gift people imagine. But none of them at this table knew that, and so their laughter pressed against me like salt in an old wound. I did not answer. My silence became its own kind of stage, though no one cared to look at it closely. To speak would have been to break the fragile comfort of the evening, to bring a shadow into a room lit with wine and warm bread. They would not have listened. They were not ready to hear. So I let them laugh, and in their laughter I felt a hollowness inside me deepen, the quiet ache of being invisible even when you are sitting in the very center of your family. What none of them knew was that the strength they mocked had once been tested in ways they could never imagine. What they saw as weakness had once been survival. But I did not explain. I simply sat there, letting their voices fade into the air, while inside me a storm began to stir. The storm of memories I had kept locked away for decades. His words came later, not in front of everyone, but in the quiet when the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed low in the living room. He stood there, tall and unbent by the years that weighed on me, his voice sharp with the confidence of youth. "You don't understand what it means to be strong." That was all he said, but it landed like a blade driven deep into my chest. He believed it. Every syllable carried the certainty of someone who thought he had already seen enough of the world to know the truth of it. To him, strength was the weight you could lift, the speed you could run, the loudness of your voice when you wanted to be heard. He looked at me and saw none of that. I wanted to answer him, but my throat closed tight. Not because I had no words, but because his challenge forced me back into a place I had sealed away long ago. His accusation was not simply about me. It was about everything I had done to keep my family untouched by the horrors I carried. I had never told them of the night we crawled through fields under fire, how my arms trembled so hard I thought they would give out, or how I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move while shaking. I had never told them of betrayal, of men who abandoned us when the world turned black with smoke, of the moments when survival meant doing things that left scars no doctor could see. And so my grandson saw only silence. He mistook it for emptiness, for ignorance. He could not know that silence itself was born of strength, the kind of strength it takes to carry unbearable memories without letting them poison those you love. His words opened something raw in me, a wound I thought had closed. He had no idea what it cost to live with ghosts you never name, to hold inside you a war you never asked for but could never escape. I sat there, staring at him, and in his young face I saw not just arrogance but innocence too. He did not mean to wound me as deeply as he did. He simply believed what the world had taught him so far, that strength was loud, visible, proven in front of others. He had yet to learn that real strength often hides in silence, in sacrifice, in the long years of carrying burdens with no applause. But in that moment, I felt the weight of his judgment press on me like the cold hand of the past itself, reminding me that maybe silence was no longer enough. The challenge he threw at me was more than an insult. It was a demand, unspoken, perhaps even unconscious, for me to reveal what I had hidden, and for the first time in decades, I felt the lock on those memories begin to turn. His words stayed with me long after the house fell quiet. I sat alone by the dying fire, staring into the embers as if they might burn away the heaviness inside me, but instead they only lit shadows I had kept buried for decades. The silence I carried was not born of choice, but of necessity. From the day I returned home, I decided that the war would remain locked behind my ribs, a secret sealed with blood and smoke. It was not pride that kept me quiet, nor shame, though there was plenty of that, but the understanding that some truths could wound more deeply than any weapon. I had lived my life as though words could erase the memories, as though never speaking of them meant they would fade. But memories do not dissolve with silence. They grow heavier, turning into stones you learn to carry in your chest until even breathing feels like labor. My grandson thought I knew nothing of strength, but he had never stood in the middle of a night so dark it swallowed sound, holding still while the world cracked open around him. He had never felt hunger gnaw until it made bones ache, or watched men vanish in a spray of earth and fire, only to march forward because there was no choice but forward. He had never known the silence of writing a letter for a comrade who would never live to sign it, or the silence of returning home and being told to forget. That was the silence I carried, not the silence of weakness, but of weight, of memories that had no place in a home full of children's laughter, in a kitchen scented with bread, in the fragile safety we had built from the ruins. I carried it to protect them, to make sure the horrors that once lived in me would not poison their joy. To them, I was just quiet, reserved, unwilling to share. But the truth was that every untold story was a shield, every unspoken name a prayer left between me and the dead. And yet, as I sat there replaying my grandson's challenge, I wondered if my silence had betrayed me. Had I let it turn into something else, something that looked like emptiness? Had I buried not only the pain, but also the strength inside it, so deeply that even my own blood could not see it? I thought of the men who had not returned, of the voices that would never be heard again. Perhaps my silence, meant to honor them, had become an erasure of my own life as well. The fire cracked softly, a coal breaking in two. I flinched at the sound, too sharp, too familiar. For a moment I was back there, the smoke, the dirt, the cries that vanished into nothing. My hands trembled and I clenched them into fists until the shaking passed. I realized then that silence had not freed me. It had only chained me more tightly. And if I died with it still locked inside me, what would remain of who I was? Nothing but the image my grandson already believed, a frail, quiet man who had done nothing worth remembering. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old beams groan. My chest felt heavy, but for the first time in years, I wondered if perhaps silence was not strength anymore. Perhaps the time had come to let the truth out, not for me, but for him, so that when he looked at me, he would see more than weakness. He would see the cost of survival. He would see the weight of sacrifice. He would see that behind my silence lived a story louder than his young voice could yet imagine. In the stillness of that night, when the house finally surrendered to sleep, I rose from my chair and made my way to the old dresser in the corner of my room. The wood creaked under my touch, the same way it had for years, but tonight the sound felt heavier, almost reluctant, as if even the furniture knew what I was about to disturb. My fingers hovered for a moment over the drawer, hesitant, because I knew what waited inside. I had not opened it in months. Sometimes years went by before I dared, yet the weight of memory always drew me back, reminding me that silence was never truly empty. It was full of what you refused to say. Inside, beneath layers of folded shirts and forgotten keepsakes, lay a photograph. The edges had curled with time, the black and white image faint now, as though the past itself were trying to fade. In it we stood shoulder to shoulder, young men with hollow faces, uniforms stiff with mud, eyes that stared out with more fear than hope. My hand traced their outlines, stopping on one face in particular. He had laughed the loudest back then, even in the darkest nights, and he had been the first to fall. The photograph still smelled faintly of smoke, though I knew that was only in my mind. I pressed it to my chest, and for a moment it felt as though all those years had collapsed into one unbearable heartbeat. Beside the photograph was a letter, folded so many times the paper was worn thin. The ink had bled at the edges, each word trembling as though written by a hand shaking with exhaustion, which it had been. It was the last letter I had written from the field, never meant for myself, but returned to me after the man it belonged to never came home. "Give this to my wife," he had said. "Tell her I fought well." But he had died in silence, and somehow the letter had found its way back to me. I never sent it. I could not. Instead, it lived here, in this drawer, yellowing with the years, a testimony to both my promise and my failure. Each time I unfolded it, the guilt rose again, not because I had survived, but because survival often means living with debts you can never repay. And then there was the scar, not the one on my shoulder, not the one on my leg, but the one that throbbed still, invisible and constant. No photograph could capture it, no letter could describe it, and yet it bled into every day of my life. It was the wound of memory itself, the cut that never healed, because it was not made by steel or bullet, but by time. The ache of watching others vanish while you remain. The ache of carrying names you dare not speak aloud. The ache of being told, once you returned home, to live as though none of it had ever happened. That scar had shaped me more than any medal, more than any uniform. Holding the photograph, the letter, I felt the weight of memory pressing against me like a tide I could not hold back. These were not relics, they were anchors, dragging me always to the same truth. I had survived, but survival had never been simple victory. It was a burden, one that aged slower than the body, one that grew heavier the longer you carried it. My grandson's words echoed in my head. "You don't understand what it means to be strong." And I realized he had only seen my silence, never the weight behind it. If he knew what lived in this drawer, what I still carried, would he still laugh? Or would he finally understand that strength is not always in the shout, but sometimes in the quiet breath that refuses to break under memory's crushing hand? I closed the drawer, carefully, as though sealing away a fragile secret, but the images did not stay inside. They followed me back to bed, climbed into the silence of the night, and settled on my chest like a stone. And I understood then, if I did not share the truth soon, my grandson would never know me. He would only know the shell of a man, not the weight that gave him shape. And when I was gone, he would inherit nothing but silence, the cruelest legacy of all. It happened on a night colder than most, though the house was warm with voices and the smell of food. We were gathered again, the family pressed around the long table, the clatter of cutlery and glasses filling the room with the rhythm of comfort. My grandson sat across from me, his shoulders squared, his voice carrying louder than it needed to. Perhaps he thought the volume gave him authority. Perhaps he thought youth gave him the right. Whatever it was, he let the words slip from his mouth, sharp and thoughtless, each one cutting deeper than the last. And then he said it. "You're a coward." The room froze. The sound of forks against plates stopped. Even the fire seemed to fall quiet, its crackle drowned by the silence that descended. No one laughed this time. No one dared. Eyes turned to me, then to him, as though waiting for me to break, to rise, to speak, to defend myself. But I did none of those things. I sat perfectly still, the word echoing through me like the toll of a heavy bell. Coward. It struck harder than his earlier mockery, harder than any dismissal of weakness, because this word carried weight, the kind of weight that could crush a man if he let it. Inside me, memories surged like a wave. Nights of crawling on my stomach, through mud so thick I thought it would swallow me whole. Days of marching, until my legs no longer belonged to me. The faces of men who had turned their backs, who had fled when courage was demanded. The real cowards. I remembered the betrayal, the ones who left us under fire, the ones whose absence nearly killed us all. I had seen cowardice. I had survived alongside it, and I knew, in the deepest part of my being, that it had never lived in me. But I did not speak these truths, not yet. To defend myself in that moment would have been to waste the story, to toss it into the open air where it would be swallowed by shock and pity and then forgotten by morning. No, the truth demanded more than a single outburst. It needed the weight of silence, the patience of time, the right moment when words would cut, not as a defense, but as revelation. So I sat there, my face calm, though my heart thundered beneath my ribs. The family shifted uncomfortably. His mother whispered his name in warning. His father placed a hand on his arm, but he shrugged it away, his jaw tight with the certainty of youth. He thought I stayed silent because he was right. He thought my stillness was surrender. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is a sword waiting to be drawn. I lowered my eyes to my plate, pretending to study the food I could no longer taste. My grandson's stare burned into me, fierce and unrelenting, demanding that I react. But I would not give him that satisfaction. Not yet. Because the truth I carried was too heavy, too sacred, to be thrown into a fight at the dinner table. It was not his accusation that would draw it out, but the weight of his own need to understand, a need he did not yet know he had. The word coward still echoed long after the plates were cleared, long after the family dispersed into corners of the house. It clung to the air like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. But deep inside, beneath the sting, I felt something stir, not anger, not shame, resolve. For years I had buried my story, convinced silence was strength. But now, I began to see that silence without truth could look like cowardice to those who did not understand, and if I allowed that to stand, then I would have failed not just myself, but him. That night, as I lay awake, listening to the restless creak of the house, I knew the time was drawing near. The lock on my memories was loosening. The story I had carried in silence for so long was pressing against me, demanding to be spoken. Not to clear my name, but to show him what real strength looked like. Not the strength of fists or shouts, but the strength of standing when standing meant breaking. My grandson thought he had crossed a line with his words. But in truth, it was I who had crossed one, quietly, inside myself. There would come a night when I would open my mouth, and when I did, the story would no longer be a burden. It would be a reckoning. It was well past midnight when the question came. The house had quieted. Each room surrendered to dreams, but I remained awake, lying in the dark, listening to the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. My thoughts moved slowly, weighed down by the word he had thrown at me earlier that night. Coward. I had carried many names in my life, but never that one, and hearing it from his mouth had carved something into me I could not shake off. I thought he was asleep, thought the distance between us was measured in years and silence. But then I heard footsteps in the hall, hesitant, uneven, the kind of steps that belong to someone wrestling with a decision. The door opened without a knock, and there he stood, shadowed by the dim glow of the lamp. His face was different in that moment, stripped of the arrogance he wore so easily during the day. He lingered there, as though the words were heavy in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor, not of fear exactly, but of something rawer, something harder to name. "Who were you in the war?" he asked. It was not curiosity that shaped the question, not the innocent interest of a boy asking for a story. It was a challenge, edged with doubt, as if he believed that even if I answered, the truth might still not be enough to matter. The question lodged itself inside me, sharper than his earlier insult, because this one reached straight into the vault of silence I had guarded for a lifetime. Who was I? For years I had refused to ask myself that question. To my family I had been a father, a grandfather, a man of routine and quiet habits. To my community, I was just another aging face, a name in the background. But who was I in the war? That man lived only in shadows now, remembered only by me, and by the ghosts of those who never came back. Memories rose before I could stop them. The mud clinging to my boots, the freezing air that cut through my lungs like glass, the smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and fear. I saw again the eyes of the men beside me, wide with exhaustion, hollowed by hunger, yet still forcing themselves to move forward because stopping was not an option. I remembered the screams, the sudden silences, the way names became prayers shouted into the smoke, sometimes answered, sometimes lost forever. That was who I was in the war. Not a coward, not a hero, but a man who kept walking when every step felt like the last. But I did not speak all of that aloud. Not yet. His question was not ready for my answer. I could see it in the way his hands clenched at his sides, in the tightness of his jaw. He had come not because he wanted the truth, but because some part of him needed to force me to reveal it, to prove myself. His doubt still lingered in his eyes, though beneath it flickered something softer, a trace of fear, maybe even shame, that he had gone too far earlier. The challenge in his voice was his way of hiding it. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time I let my eyes hold his without looking away. In that silence, I wanted him to see what he had missed before, that strength does not always raise its voice, that endurance does not always demand recognition. I wanted him to feel the weight of the question he had asked, to know that answers like mine cannot be given lightly, cannot be spoken and then left behind at the doorway. Who was I in the war? The truth lived in photographs tucked away in drawers, in letters that would never reach their destinations, in scars that did not show but never stopped aching. The truth was written in the eyes of the boy he was speaking to now. Because if I had not been who I was back then, he would not be here at all. I did not answer him that night, not directly. Instead, I let the question hang in the air between us, heavy and alive, knowing that when the time came to tell him, the words would not just be a story. They would be a reckoning. For him, for me, for everything that silence had kept locked away for too long. For years, my lips had been sealed, the words locked behind a wall of silence I thought would protect us all. But that night, as I sat across from my grandson, the question he had thrown at me, still hanging in the air, like a blade between us, I felt the weight of silence break. My chest tightened, my throat burned, and for the first time in decades, I opened my mouth to speak of things I had buried so deep, I had almost convinced myself they belonged to someone else. The words came slowly at first, thick and heavy, each one dragged up from the pit of memory. I told him about the first night, the night we all thought would be our last. The sky was blacker than I had ever known, not with the calm of stars, but with the smoke of burning earth. The air itself seemed to tremble, as though the world had grown tired of holding itself together. We were young, far too young, standing in a line with rifles that felt heavier than our own bodies, our boots sinking into the mud as though the ground wanted to swallow us whole. Every breath carried the metallic taste of fear, and every heartbeat felt like it might be the final one. I remembered the silence before it began. That dreadful silence when the night holds its breath, when the ground seems to know what the men do not. We looked at each other, and though no one spoke, our eyes confessed what our mouths would not. We are not ready. We are not enough. And then it came. The thunder of shells tearing the sky apart, the earth shaking beneath us, the deafening roar of a world breaking open. I told him how the ground split, how fire lit faces that moments before had been hidden in shadow, how the air filled with the cries of men who would never cry again. I told him how, in those first hours, I had felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life, how I had pressed my face to the dirt, my hands clutching the cold earth, whispering prayers I hadn't known I remembered. Each minute was a lifetime, each second a decision between rising and breaking. Dawn felt like a myth we had been told as children, some story to keep us moving, though none of us believed we would ever see it again. Yet somehow, against reason, against fear, against the cruelty of chance, dawn did come, and with it came the sight of what was left. The ground was littered with the bodies of boys who had laughed only hours before. Their laughter still rang in my ears, mocking the silence that followed. As I spoke, my grandson did not move. The defiance that had always burned in his eyes had gone out, replaced by something else. Not pity, not yet respect, but a stunned stillness, the kind that comes when the world tilts and shows you a side you never imagined. My voice was unsteady, but I kept going, because I could feel the dam had broken and there was no stopping now. I told him that on that first night I learned the truth about strength. It was not in how loud you shouted, nor in how tall you stood. Strength was in the man who kept crawling forward through the mud while his body begged him to stay down. Strength was in the trembling hand that still clutched a rifle, not because it was fearless, but because it refused to let go. Strength was surviving until the sun rose, even when you had no right to believe it would. I did not tell him everything that night. The betrayals, the wounds, the unspeakable things we endured. That would come later. But in those first words, I gave him a glimpse of the man I had been, the boy I had been forced to stop being. For the first time, I let him see beyond the quiet shell of the old man he thought he knew. For the first time, I let him stand beside me in the mud, under that blackened sky, listening to the roar of death and the stubborn whisper of life. And when I finished, the room was silent again. But it was not the silence of dismissal or mockery. It was the silence of something heavy being passed from one generation to the next, not in medals or trophies, but in truth. I saw his eyes widen when I spoke of the first night. But I did not stop there. My voice carried me further, into places I had sworn I would never return to, into the marrow of memories that had burned themselves into me so deeply they lived there still. I told him that war was not only fire and steel, not only mud and hunger. It was trust. Trust that the man beside you would not leave when the darkness closed in. Trust that when the ground shook and the air screamed, he would still be there, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same fear but refusing to abandon you to it. And then I told him what happens when that trust breaks. There had been a boy, younger than me by 2 years, though at the time we all looked the same age, which was both too old and too young. He laughed louder than the rest, played cards by candlelight, told us stories about a girl back home. He said he would marry her if he lived, and we believed him. We believed because belief was the only thing that kept the fire away at night. But belief is a fragile thing in the trenches. One night, when the fire rained heavier than ever, when the mud became blood, when the world tilted so far we thought it would not right itself again, I turned my head, and he was gone. His place beside me was empty, the earth still trembling where his boots had been. He had run. He was. At first I thought maybe I had lost him in the smoke, that he had been thrown back by the force of an explosion. But as the minutes turned into hours, as the fire slowed and the morning crept in pale and hollow, I knew. He had left us, fled into the dark, carrying his own life like a torch and leaving ours to be swallowed by the flames. And that was when I learned that betrayal can kill faster than bullets. Because when a bullet finds its mark, the pain is sharp, clear, final. But when a man you trusted leaves you, when he abandons you to die, the wound is different. It spreads. It poisons. It makes you question every face beside you. It makes you wonder if the next breath you take is alone. I told my grandson how that night carved a scar in me, deeper than any blade. We survived, yes. Not all of us, but enough. And when we stumbled back to camp, our boots caked with mud that was not only mud, our eyes raw from smoke and tears, he was there, clean, untouched. His hands did not tremble. He had saved himself while others had burned. He avoided our eyes, and we avoided his. No one said the word, but we all carried it in silence. Coward. and yet he wore no shame. He walked among us, alive, while the others did not. The world outside the trenches never understood. They think betrayal is an argument, a broken promise, a harsh word left unresolved. But betrayal in the trenches is different. It is the sudden knowledge that when the darkness comes, the man beside you might choose his own life over yours. And once you learn that, you never see the world the same way again. As I spoke, my grandson's face shifted. His earlier bravado had drained away, replaced by something heavier, something more uncertain. He had thrown that word at me, coward, without knowing what it meant, without ever feeling its weight. And now he sat still, his fists clenched in his lap, his jaw set tight, as though trying to hold back the shame of realizing he had accused me of the one thing I had endured but never been. I leaned back then, letting the silence stretch between us. I did not need to tell him how betrayal lingers, how it haunts a man longer than the sound of gunfire. I did not need to explain how even now, decades later, I sometimes woke in the night reaching for a comrade who was no longer there. The story itself was enough. It filled the room, settled over us like smoke, and in that silence, he began to understand that strength is not always in how you fight. Sometimes it is in how you endure the wounds no one else can see, the wounds that never stop bleeding inside. There comes a moment in every man's life when the body begs to surrender, when the earth itself seems to pull you down, whispering that it would be easier to stay where you've fallen. I told my grandson that I had known such a moment, the one that branded itself into my bones forever. We had been pinned down for hours, fire screaming above us, the night lit not by stars but by bursts of flame that turned shadows into monsters. The ground was alive with trembling, the trench no longer a refuge but a grave waiting to be filled. Men lay pressed against the mud, their faces pale, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow. No one moved. No one dared. To raise your head even an inch felt like asking for death to take you. I was small, weaker than most. My frame had always been slight, my strength measured more in endurance than in muscle. They had joked about it in training, told me I would never last, that I'd be the first to break. And perhaps they were right, because that night I wanted to break. My arms shook, my chest burned, every part of me cried to stay pressed to the ground. But then came the sound. A cry, muffled and sharp, from just beyond the trench. One of ours had fallen, caught in the open, too far to crawl back, too close to be ignored. His voice cut through the thunder of shells, raw with terror, begging not for glory but for life. And none of us moved. We were paralyzed, chained by fear, buried alive in our own silence. I told my grandson how I felt my heart split in that moment, because I knew that if no one rose, that cry would end in silence, swallowed like so many before. And I knew, too, that I was the least likely, the least expected, the one no one would have chosen. But something inside me, not pride, not courage, not even bravery as people imagine it, pushed against the weight of the earth. It was something simpler, something sharper, the refusal to let another man die alone. My hands dug into the mud, my knees lifted, and before I could think, I was on my feet. The world exploded around me, the air slicing with bullets, the night screaming louder than my pulse. My legs carried me faster than I believed they could, my arms reaching down to grab him, to drag him back one desperate inch at a time. He was heavy, heavier than I thought I could bear, his uniform soaked with blood, his body limp, but I pulled and pulled, each step a war inside my own body. I thought surely I would fall, surely I would break, and yet somehow I did not. Somehow the bullets missed. Somehow the ground did not swallow me. Somehow we made it back. When we collapsed inside the trench, the others stared. They said nothing, not then, not later, but their eyes spoke what words could not. They had seen me rise when no one else would. They had seen the body they had mocked, the weak frame they had dismissed, do what their stronger limbs had not dared. And though no medals were given, no speeches made, in that silent moment I learned that true courage is not the absence of fear, nor the strength of the body, but the decision to move when your soul is screaming at you to stay still. I told my grandson that, even now, decades later, I could still feel the weight of that man in my arms, the warmth of his blood on my skin, the sound of his breath rattling against my shoulder. I could still feel the terror, the fire, the disbelief of being alive when logic said I should not be. That moment had lived inside me ever since, not as triumph, not as pride, but as proof. Proof that even the frail can carry more than anyone expects. Proof that courage often hides in the smallest, most unlikely shell. Proof that strength is not what others see, but what you choose to do when no one else will rise. And as I finished, my grandson sat frozen, his young face pale, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He had called me weak, had spat the word coward, but now the silence between us spoke louder than his accusations ever had. For the first time he began to see me not as a relic, not as an old man fading in his chair, but as someone who had stood in fire and carried another through it. And though I said no more, though I let the weight of the story settle like dust, I knew something had shifted in him. He had glimpsed the truth of strength, not in the body, not in the noise, but in the quiet moment when one man chooses to rise. I told him then that courage, as rare and fleeting as it was, carried a price, and that price was survival. People imagine survival as victory, as triumph, as a medal shining on a chest, but survival in truth is a wound that never closes. It is waking each morning with the knowledge that you lived while others did not, that the ground which swallowed them spared you, though you cannot explain why. It is walking through life with ghosts pressed against your back, their voices whispering in the dark, their eyes staring at you from the spaces between dreams. I began to tell him of the men we lost. Not in numbers. Numbers mean nothing when it is your brother lying in the mud. But in faces, in names, in moments stolen too soon. I told him of the one who sang softly each night before sleep, his voice cracked but steady, carrying us into rest when the fear was too heavy to bear. He never finished his last song. I told him of the one who had carried a folded photograph of his daughter, so worn it had nearly dissolved between his fingers, a photo he kissed each morning before pulling on his boots. That photo was found in the mud, but he never was. I told him of the boy, for he was only a boy, no more than 17, who had dreamed of studying architecture, who traced designs into the dirt with a stick during quiet hours. One night a shell erased both his drawings and his body, leaving only silence in his place. And I told him of the worst part, that I remembered all of them. Not as heroes in some noble story, not as statues cast in bronze, but as flesh and breath, as laughter cut short, as eyes closing in terror. They did not die in glory. They died in mud, in pain, in silence. And I survived. When I came home, people spoke to me as if I had conquered something, as if stepping back across that threshold into normal life made me stronger. They did not see the nights when I woke drenched in sweat, choking on the sound of screams that had never been mine, but which I carried as if they were. They did not know how the smell of smoke could make my hands tremble, how fireworks on holidays made me want to bury my face in the dirt just to escape the thunder of memory. They clapped me on the back, called me lucky, called me brave, but I was neither. I was simply the one who had been left standing when others had not. I looked at my grandson and told him that survival is not a crown you wear. It is a shadow that follows you into every corner of your life. It makes you smile when you do not feel like smiling, laugh when you feel hollow, keep quiet when people want stories, because you know that words could never hold the truth. Survival means carrying the weight of the lives that ended before yours, knowing that in every breath you take, there are others who were denied the chance to breathe again. It means understanding that every sunrise you see has cost someone else their last. I returned home not as a hero, but as a man marked by absence. I carried their faces in my chest, their voices in my dreams, and no matter how many years have passed, I still wake some nights with the sound of their cries in my ears, as if the war itself has reached out through time to remind me of the price it demanded. That is what survival is. Not victory, not honor, but a debt that cannot be paid, a silence that never ends, a scar carved so deep it becomes who you are. And as I said those words, my grandson's eyes lowered. He did not speak, he did not move, he simply listened, and for the first time I could see in him not defiance, not arrogance, but the dawning recognition that strength is not the roar of conquest, but the quiet endurance of a man who carries the weight of the dead and still finds a way to walk. As the words left me heavy and unadorned, I saw something shift in him. For so long his face had been carved from defiance, his jaw tight, his eyes sharpened with the pride of youth. But now, as I sat across from him and let my memories spill into the space between us, that mask began to crumble. His lips parted slightly, not to speak, but to hold back what trembled beneath. His shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen before, as if the weight of the truth I had carried for decades had slid from my chest and settled, for the first time, onto his. I told him no more in that moment. Silence did the rest. The room itself seemed to close around us, pressing the air heavy and still. And in that silence, his face changed. The bravado drained away. The hardness in his gaze softened. And what rose instead was something fragile. The first bloom of understanding. He blinked too quickly, and in the faint light, I saw the shimmer of tears gathering in his eyes. He tried to hide them, looking away, clenching his fists as if holding back emotion could prove him strong. But the more he fought, the more it betrayed him. His throat tightened, his lips trembled, and then, finally, a single tear traced down his cheek. It was not weakness, it was awakening. That tear was the recognition that strength is not in the body alone, not in the sharpness of the tongue or the force of muscle. Strength was in surviving nights that should have ended you, in carrying voices that never stopped echoing, in rising from mud and fire to keep walking, even when your soul begged you to lie down. He saw it now, not because I had demanded he see, but because the truth had broken through the walls of his certainty and forced him to feel what he had never felt before, the weight of a life lived not in ease, but in endurance. He covered his face for a moment as if ashamed of his tears, but I did not move to comfort him. Comfort would have lessened the moment, would have told him that grief could be tucked away as easily as a napkin at dinner. Instead, I let him sit in it. I let him carry the heaviness of what I had given him, because strength is not found in avoiding pain, but in allowing it to mark you, to change you. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were red, his cheeks wet. But the boy who had mocked me, who had laughed at my frailty, was gone. In his place sat someone different, not yet a man, but no longer a child. He stared at me with a reverence he did not yet know how to name, his voice lost, but his heart open. The tears had spoken for him. They had said what words could not. I understand now. Not fully, not yet, but more than I did before. And in that moment, I felt something inside me loosen. A chain I had worn for years, a silence I had thought would be my grave. Because those tears told me my story had not been wasted. It had landed, It had reached him, and for the first time, I believed that perhaps when I was gone, he would not remember me as a weak old man, but as someone who had carried the unthinkable and still remained standing. That was the strength he had never seen. That was the strength his tears now honored. His tears had not yet dried when the question slipped out of him, trembling like a secret he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the quiet of the house, but I heard every syllable as clearly as if it had been shouted. "Why did you never tell me? Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" It was not an accusation, not this time. It was something softer, something weighed down by regret and awe, a plea to understand the silence that had stretched between us for so many years. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I saw the boy and the man inside him wrestling for space. His eyes searched mine as though he could pull the answer out without words, as though the truth might be etched into my face. And in that searching, I saw the reflection of all the years he had judged me, all the careless words he had thrown like stones, and now, the raw ache of knowing how wrong he had been. My answer came not as defense, but as confession. My voice was steady, though my chest ached with the weight of the words. Because real strength doesn't need applause. That was all I said at first, but the silence after demanded more, so I let the truth rise, slow and heavy. Strength isn't the medals they pin on your chest, nor the cheers of a crowd who knows nothing of what you endured. It's not the stories told loudly over tables, or the victories paraded in daylight. Real strength is quieter, lonelier. It is carrying what others couldn't, shouldering burdens that no one will ever see, and choosing to live on without demanding the world recognize it. He listened, his breath caught, his hands folded tight as though holding himself together. I went on, because I wanted him to understand that silence had not been cowardice but survival. If I had spoken sooner, if I had poured out these stories while the wounds were fresh, they would have consumed me, and if I had spoken too often, I would have turned pain into spectacle, reduced lives and deaths into tales for entertainment. I could not do that to them, the ones who didn't come back. Their names, their faces, they deserved more than applause. They deserved dignity, and so I carried them in silence, where they could not be mocked, where they could not be forgotten. The room was thick with the weight of it. I saw his eyes glisten again, not just from sorrow, but from a dawning comprehension that this truth was not only mine, but something I was placing in his hands. He had asked for strength his whole life, demanded to see it, to measure it in me. And now he saw that strength is not a thing you hold up to the light. It is the shadow you live with, the endurance that keeps you standing long after others have fallen. He shook his head slowly, as though the enormity of it resisted being understood. His lips parted as if to speak again, but no words came. Instead, his gaze softened, and in that gaze I saw something I had never seen in him before. Not pity, not doubt, but reverence. I leaned back, weary from the weight of the confession. And for a moment I thought of the men who were gone. Perhaps, I thought, this was the way they lived on. Not in medals, not in songs, but in the trembling eyes of a boy who finally understood what strength really was. And if that truth stayed with him, then my silence all those years had not been in vain. The morning came quietly, as if even the sun knew not to disturb the fragile thread of truth that had been woven between us the night before. I rose slowly, my joints stiff with the familiar ache of years, the weight of memory still pressing against my chest. I expected nothing to be different. I had lived long enough to know that revelations often fade with the dawn, that words spoken in the dark can dissolve like smoke once the world returns to its ordinary rhythm. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I saw him there, my grandson, already awake, already waiting. He did not look at me with the same defiance that had once burned so bright in his eyes. That fire, sharp and reckless, had dimmed. In its place was something steadier, something I recognized not as weakness, but as the first spark of humility. He did not speak right away. Instead, he rose to his feet when I entered, a simple gesture, but in it was more respect than any words could have carried. He stood not as a challenger, not as someone eager to prove himself stronger, but as a student rising in the presence of a teacher. And in that moment I felt the shift, the quiet turning of a tide I had thought would never move. His eyes lingered on me differently now. The contempt was gone, washed away by the night's confessions. Where once he had seen frailty, he now seemed to see weight. Where once he had seen silence, he now saw depth. He studied me as if every crease in my face, every tremor in my hand, carried meaning he had overlooked. And though his lips did not form the words, I could feel the question alive in him. What else have I not seen? What else do I still need to learn? We ate together without much sound, the clatter of spoons and the murmur of morning filling the space that no longer felt so empty. He did not rush, he did not laugh, he did not mock. Instead, he mirrored my pace, careful, deliberate, almost reverent. When I rose from the table, he rose too, not out of habit, but out of choice, as though each step I took carried weight enough to be followed. I thought of how different this was from the boy who once called me weak, who once threw the word coward like a stone across the table. That boy had measured strength in muscle and noise, in victories loud and visible. But the young man before me now was beginning to understand a different measure, that respect is not owed to power alone, but to endurance, that honor does not come from the roar of triumph, but from the quiet dignity of survival. As the day unfolded, I noticed how he hovered closer than before. When I reached for my coat, he was there to steady it. When I stepped out into the morning air, he matched his stride to mine, not rushing ahead, not dragging behind. And though he still said little, every gesture spoke louder than the bravado he once wielded. He was learning, not through lecture, but through presence. He was watching me the way a craftsman studies the hands of a master, not to imitate exactly, but to understand the patience, the weight, the rhythm behind each movement. And as I walked beside him, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years I had feared that my silence had erased me, that when I was gone there would be nothing left of me in the hearts of those who came after. But now I saw it, in the quiet respect of his gaze, in the careful way he walked beside me. My story, heavy as it was, had found a place to rest. It had taken root not in applause, not in recognition, but in the heart of a boy who had once dismissed me, and now looked at me as though I carried the map to something he had never known he needed. That morning, I realized I no longer walked alone. That evening, the house was filled with the same sounds it always was. The murmur of voices from the other rooms, the creak of the old floorboards, the soft hum of life carrying on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The silence between my grandson and me was no longer heavy with judgment or distance. It had become something else. A bridge, fragile but unbroken, stretching between generations. For the first time I felt that the stories I had carried in my chest for so long, hidden away like forbidden relics, had found a place where they could live beyond me. I rose slowly from my chair, my body weary, each step a reminder of the years I had borne. In the past, when I left a room, he would stay seated, absorbed in his own world, quick to forget I was even there. But now, I heard the scrape of a chair behind me. My grandson stood. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His movements said more than words ever could. He was not letting me walk away alone. He followed, his stride slower than usual, deliberate, as though matching himself to mine. Not to mock my pace, not to pity me, but to honor it. When I turned my head slightly, I saw it in his face. A gaze no longer lit by arrogance, but steadied by reverence. The boy who had once measured strength by noise and muscle now saw it in silence, in endurance, in the kind of strength that does not shout but carries on, quietly, faithfully, without asking for recognition. He had seen my weakness, yes, the tremor in my hands, the bend of my back, the scars time had written into my body. But he had also seen what lay beneath, the storms survived, the burdens borne, the ghosts carried with a dignity that had required more courage than any battle. And in his eyes I recognized something I had longed for but never dared to expect. Respect. Not the shallow respect given out of duty, but the deep, unspoken respect that comes only when someone finally understands. He knew now that silence could be its own kind of strength, the kind that endures long after applause fades, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it has already paid its price in blood and memory. I walked slowly down the hallway, the shadows stretching long across the floor. He stayed at my side, close enough that I could feel his presence, steady and unyielding. And for the first time in many years, I did not feel like a man carrying the past alone. I felt as though I had passed something on, not a burden, not a curse, but a truth that would outlive me. Because one day, I will no longer be here. One day, my chair will remain empty. My voice will fall silent. But I know now that my story will not vanish with me. It will live in him, in the way he carries himself, in the way he listens more deeply, in the way he learns to measure strength, not by what the world applauds, but by what the heart endures. He will remember that I was not weak, that silence is not emptiness, and that sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the loudest truths. And perhaps when he is older, when his own grandchildren sit across from him with the same impatience and doubt that once burned in his eyes, he will tell them what I once told him. He will tell them that strength does not always raise its voice, that courage is often hidden in the smallest of choices, and that survival, though heavy, is its own kind of triumph. My story will live, not in books or speeches, but in the quiet strength he carries forward, strength he will never again mistake for weakness. As I reached the doorway, I felt him fall into step beside me, and I understood. The legacy of quiet strength had already begun to outlive me, and in that moment I knew I would never walk alone again.